I grew up always loving movies. I love to go to the movies. And my mom was an artist, and my dad was just kind of a movie lover. He just loved to go to movies. And so, between the two of them, they kind of encouraged my interest in movies. At an early age, my dad took me to the public library where they were showing a 16 millimeter print of the movie Wages of Fear. And I was under 10 years old, and it was a film in French. I don't speak French, but the images spoke to me. And I saw this amazing epic story with these characters, and there was pathos, and there was intensity and certain emotions that I could understand because of the cinematic storytelling. And I just got hooked on movies. And I remember seeing all the Star Wars movies when they came out, and all the Indiana Jones movies, James Bond movies. All these movies were exciting to me, and the movie theater was a place where I could just escape and be in this place that I loved. And because of my dad being a movie lover and my mom being an artist, they encouraged that. And I went to film school at SUNY Purchase near New York City, and I studied film there. And after I graduated, I knew that I wanted to get into editing even at that point, because I had done some editing in film school on 16 millimeter, and I loved it. And there was something I just found very inspiring about that process, and very calming in a way. There seemed to be, at least at a glance, some kind of a civil place that was an editing room, and I wanted to be there. And so I was able to, through the kindness of strangers and people who were very helpful, I was able to land a job as an assistant editor at a commercial editing company in New York. I had almost a chance meeting with an editor who let me use his name to get my foot in the door at this place. And he was a stranger. He was an editor who I didn't really know, but he agreed to kind of have a meeting with me, see me, and give me advice. And because I was a kid fresh out of college, and he let me, pass his name on, and that helped me get my foot in the door. And I got a job at this commercial editing company, and that's kind of where I started. That's where I learned Avid. Avid was pretty new at the time. Features were still cutting on film primarily. Other genres like documentary. At that time, they couldn't afford Avid because Avid was very expensive at that time, and also the storage just wasn't there. The image quality wasn't there yet. So in a way, nonlinear editing, Avid was kind of perfect for short form, for commercials. And so the company I worked for had 9 Avids, which at the time was a lot. I kind of learned the ropes there. That's where I learned Avid. And then I longed to kind of move into feature films. I always longed to work in movies. And so I left commercials, and I pounded the pavement and tried to get on movies. And I ended up working in indie features as an assistant editor. And at some point, I got recommended to the editor Tim Squires, who edits all of Ang Lee's movies. And he was in between feature films, and he was editing some commercials. And someone recommended me because he was looking for an assistant editor who was versed in commercials. And so I ended up meeting Tim, and I worked with him and assisted him on these commercials, and we hit it off. And he took me with him on his next movie, and he got me into the union, basically. And that's how I kind of started my assistant editing feature career in New York. And I did that for a while until, work got very slow. And I think when you work in New York, you end up taking any work that you can get. So you work in all sorts of different genres. So I worked in TV promos, documentary, I worked in fashion videos. I took whatever work I could get. But at some point, work got very slow, and I decided to move to LA, and I moved to Hollywood, and eventually got back into the assistant editor feature track, and it's those connections that I made, when I was an assistant editor, connections with producers and filmmakers. Those connections were ended up being very helpful to me later on. It was a producer who I worked with as an assistant who ended up recommending me for the Whiplash short film. There was a producer named Cooper Samuelson who I had worked with before as an assistant editor, and he was a producer trying to get Whiplash, the feature film, off the ground, but no one would give him money because no one wanted to see a movie about a jazz drummer. So Cooper and his producing partner Helen Esterbrook had this great idea to take 20 pages out of the feature script, get a crew together, get some actors together, film it, and then they'd have like a little sizzle reel that they could show to financiers and get them interested in the movie. So Cooper, sent me the script and said, we've got very little money, but, we think you're great. Are you interested in doing this little piece? And it was so small they didn't even call it a short film at that time. We're just going to do this little proof of concept. And I read the script, and it was one of the best scripts I had ever read, the feature script to Whiplash. And I said, I'd love to meet the director. And Cooper hooked us up, and I had coffee with Damien Chazelle, and we just found that we loved a lot of the same movies. And we started talking about editing and started talking about, movies and scenes where filmmakers had put frames in, like flash frames, to give some type of impact, or they would sometimes do the opposite, where they take frames out so that you would feel a cut or feel some sort of motion or impact. And since we were talking about frames, like, it felt like, okay, this guy's really, he's really he's into the minutia, he's into editing. We were kind of speaking the same language. So we did the short film together, which was an amazing experience and a lot of fun. And then the financing came through for the feature film version of Whiplash, and he asked me to do it. And I think the financiers were initially very hesitant about having me cut the feature film version of Whiplash, because I had only a couple small features to my on my resume, and they weren't very big, and I think they were just worried. So with Damien's support and with the producer's support, they kind of pushed and let me do it. I think they basically backstopped me with a bigger name editor and promised the financier that, don't worry, if Tom screws this up, we'll just bring in this guy who is, a real editor. And luckily it never came to that. So the truth is, I told my assistant editors when we started, I said, here's the good news, guys. The schedule is so tight for Whiplash. We have so little time that I don't actually think there's time for them to fire us. So I think we're good. Every one of Damien's projects is a big learning experience for me. He loves the editing process. He is there with me the whole time. He pushes me to try things that I would not try otherwise. I think on Whiplash, you can never be too fast. We worked on things and got them to a certain speed and pace, and often we would continue to pace it up, or we'd continue. It was almost like shrink wrapping. We just continue shrink wrapping until we felt the story was as tight as it could be. On La La Land, it was a movie that was romantic and very languid and flowing, and on that movie, it was all about, in some cases, not cutting. How can we create an experience that's much more fluid and not about cuts at right angles? You want to really feel the camera moves, but feel them in a very gentle way. A lot of it had to do with finding solutions to story issues and finding ways to lift out things but still be invisible, and still have this kind of fluid feeling, on First Man, because of the cinema verite style and the documentary way that Damien wanted to shoot, it was about being open to finding value in all the footage you have. It was, again, a reminder that every piece of film, every camera rack, every little moment that might at a glance seem messy, it might actually have a place in your story. Every frame potentially has value. And what Damien and I always find is that, what's perfect on the page often is very different when you commit it to film. And, certainly we found that on Whiplash, which had a script that, no pun intended, was tight as a drum. I thought the script was really perfect. I loved it. And it had all the right emotional beats and all the right moments of lingering and pausing, but then all the great spectacular moments of rhythm and velocity. And but once you get the dailies, once performances inhabit these characters, once you get looks and eyes and reactions, you often find that less is more. With Damien's films, music is always a big part of it. And it was definitely a big part of it on Whiplash, in the big band sense, and on La La Land with the big orchestral score, and the musical part of it. You can't escape it. Those two movies are music movies. With First Man, at a glance, it really seemed like it was going to be very different from those two movies. It felt like it was going to be a departure from Damien's musical, obsessions. But in fact, we worked very closely. Damien and I worked very closely with Justin Hurwitz, the composer, on First Man, and we worked in the same manner that we did on La La Land. Justin had a room next to mine, and we shared a door, so he was in an adjoining room, and he started, his music during pre-production. So by the time I started assembling the movie and got into the editing with Damien, Justin had already created several melodies for First Man. He had already created a lot of the music that I could temp with. So unlike other movies where you often pilfer other movie soundtracks to get what you need for your temp score, I was always temping with Justin Hurwitz's score. These were rough digital mock-ups of his score, not real instruments, but it was always his music. And so, in fact, we continued this kind of musical workflow that we had on La La Land. We continued that on First Man. And, the interesting thing about working with Damien, because he's a musician, is that, I work differently with music with him than I do on other projects. The music really informs the cutting. So often, because Damien's a musician, he has a good idea of music edits that he wants to do or doesn't want to do, things that he thinks will sound good or not sound good. So often we have to have Justin's score first in order to react to that, in order to cut to that. So my assistants would turn over picture to him, and he would, score to that, and then he would end up giving a file back to the assistants, and it would come back to me, and they'd put it in, underneath my picture. And it was they got pretty fast at doing that, because we seemed to do it all the time. And then we could give that scene back to Justin and have him refine what he did to better match my picture. But often we'd find that it would kind of cut both ways, so to speak. He would make an adjustment, but then he'd want me to adjust picture to match. So we had a very fluid kind of flow back and forth. And traditionally, music often follows picture. In fact, on other movies, you wait until you're locked or close to locked before the composer starts doing his work. Here, Justin was working alongside us, and it was more of a kind of a 50-50 relationship where we would kind of trade off back and forth, picture sound, picture music. And so I would say that Justin's music informed the picture cutting to a large degree, informed it more than it does, I think, on other pictures. When I meet young editors and aspiring editors and filmmakers, I tell them to never give up. Always try to do what you love. If you really want to cut, try to cut all the time. Even if you have to take an assistant job, even if that's what you do for your work, for your living, try to cut on the side, cut small projects. The toughest part about getting out of school, or even not being in film school, the toughest part about being the low guy in the totem pole is often that you feel like you have to pay your dues. And to a certain extent, people will make you pay your dues. But there also is another way of looking at it, and that is that when you are the low guy in the totem pole, you sometimes will be given opportunities that other people will not be given. When I was up for the Whiplash short film, I got a phone call because someone thought I would be good at editing, but mainly because I was cheap, mainly because they couldn't afford the better editors, So I think that's the thing to remember, based on my own experience, is that, as a young aspiring editor, you might think that you can't compete because there are so many other editors who are much more talented, much more experienced, much more well-known. But the truth is, you might be exactly what they're looking for, And I know that from my own experience, that had people known the type of film that Whiplash was going to be, had they known how brilliant Damien Chazelle truly is, I think that they would have leapt at this opportunity to cut this short version of Whiplash, but no one really knew, and that's because it was under the radar, and because that you don't know. And so I tell people to be open to all opportunities, and try to, as best you can, try to keep your living expenses down, try to keep your overhead low. The great editor Sally Menke used to give advice about that. She would say, I read an interview with her where she said, try to keep your overhead low, because you never know that freebie project you do could be your Reservoir Dogs, And so I try to remind people that, often the opportunities that don't seem like they're going to amount to anything actually end up being your big break.